Okay, so, trying to keep my mind occupied. I've been watching a lot of stuff on boat building. There's a lot of things that we like to give people credit for that they don't deserve the credit for. For example, Germany in World War One and World War Two. In World War One, they tended to overcomplicate things, over-engineer them, resulting in a situation where, in order to keep up with production levels, they had to copy French and English engine designs. They made the frames for their airplanes out of welded metal in World War One, whereas the British were making theirs out of wood. However, a lot of that comes down to a guy named Anthony Fokker, who wasn't even German, he was Belgian. Then, let's look at World War Two. Man, everything was over-engineered. Over-engineered to the point that it just constantly fell apart. Come up with something that works and stick with it. So the stuff I've been watching most recently is on ancient shipbuilding. Where the hell did I put my ashtray? Anyway, there's a lot of talk about clinker-built ships. That would be Viking ships. There it is. Well, at least our association with Viking ships. Now, there's ships like the Sutton Hoo that really you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between it and a Viking ship if you saw them side by side, because Viking ships aren't all the same. There are some Viking ships that would be stable on a river, but extremely unstable at sea. Some of those long ships were built specifically for specific rivers. They never left the river. The reason for that is because they would sink out on the ocean waves. And with some of the Viking ships that they've been remaking, especially the ones from Dublin, some of those are very seaworthy. But they were found in ocean ports, whereas a lot of the other Viking ships that we find, they're at burials or they're sunken in rivers. And another thing to make the point of is that clinker-built ships have been around since longer than the Vikings. It's kind of like horned helmets. If you were part of the Ledang, which is the Norwegian Defense Force during the Viking Age, you weren't a Viking, you were a professional soldier. A Viking was a raider. They would wear whatever they got their hands on. Now, during that era, it was very common for them to kill somebody in battle, and if they like the armor, take the armor. If you're fighting with Persians and you like the Persian helmet, you'll take the Persian helmet. If you're fighting against the Batavians and they have a better sword, you might take their better sword. You might take a better shield. You might end up not having to wear a cotton jerkin anymore, and now you're able to wear chainmail. The Romans and the Vikings did exactly the same thing. They took what they wanted from other cultures. They took their favorite parts from other cultures. One example with the Romans, their gods came from all over the place. And as a result, their temples and their construction methods came from all over the place. If they built an Egyptian temple, it was built in an Egyptian fashion. They also had their swords and their helmets. Their helmet was a Gallic helmet. Their sword was the Gladius Hispaniensis, and later adaptations of the Gladius Hispaniensis, which is a sword from the Iberian Peninsula. That would be Spain and Portugal. God, my back is killing me. Now, some of the stuff that I'm telling you might be slightly incorrect, and I do apologize for that. I'm trying to not make this into a 40-hour video. Now, when we look at the Viking ships, we're giving the Vikings an awful lot of credit for borrowing things from others. Yeah. So there's a video game that came out. It's called Bannerlords. I've never played it so far as I'm aware. But they just came out with a adaptation that allows you to play different ships from different eras. And it's called War Sails. One of the adaptations they made for it allows you to play as the ancient Romans and the Carthaginians. And the guy was talking about how the Viking ships that were in the game, because it's supposed to be the ancient Romans, this would be about 1,000 years or round about 1,000 years before the Vikings came. 500 years before the Vikings came at the earliest, depending on if you figure the first Vikings were around the 790s, and the Roman Empire lasted until about, we could say it lasted until about 250 AD, but we could also say that it lived on in the Eastern Empire, which would be Byzantium, Constantinople, what is now Istanbul. So if we consider that, or even consider the later Holy Roman Empire, which would be Germany, how strange is that? The Germans, who have culturally been at odds with Italy forever, going back to well before the Teutoburg Forest incident, became the Holy Roman Empire. It was actually a combination of between 11 and 13 Germanic states that formed together to basically do what the Pope said. Later on, they got too much power and got kicked around a bit and became Imperial Germany. So that would be World War I with the Kaiser Wilhelm II. So let's go into the ships a bit more, because that's what I've been studying. I've been studying a lot of stuff that people say is untrue or couldn't happen. There's a boat called the Dover boat, and people are saying, oh, if it's tied together, it'll never work. Well, you could say the same thing about the Khufu ship, and it's well over 100 feet long, and it's tied together. It's also older than the Dover boat. Older and much larger. The Dover boat would float. The same thing with the Egyptians. I mean, we find pieces of their ships all over the place out in the middle of the desert. They were tied together and they had little symbols that were scratched into them so you knew what piece went where. Now we got a bunch of these Viking things where people want to claim that these Viking ships, these inventions from the Vikings and so on, like the clinker built thing. Well, clinker building, there's ships that are at least going back to like 430 BC that were clinker built. There's ships that were built by the Roman Empire that were clinker built. When Julius Caesar had his campaigns against Britain, and then later on Claudius had his campaigns against Britain, they hired Danish soldiers. Of course, it wasn't Denmark at the time, was it? Probably not. It was probably called something completely different. But those soldiers were known for their seamanship, which at the time the Romans would stay close to shore. If they couldn't see shore, then they weren't going. They didn't want to get on salt water at all, unless it was the Mediterranean. They, for the most part, didn't know how to swim. A lot of Romans had no idea how to swim. And then, of course, as far as boat building goes, yes, the Roman army was an army of engineers. However, when it came to boat building, and when it came to being able to swim with full armor on, this is what they hired the Danish people for. It wasn't just Danish. The Germans were hired. That's right. Even though Germany and Italy were at war, and at least at odds with each other when they weren't at war, there were still German mercenaries that were hired by the Romans. There were Danish mercenaries hired by the Romans. And later on, even though those regions were not a part of the Roman Empire, there were actual legions, at least one that we know of Northmen. At least one, and a possibility of up to three. That's some pretty interesting stuff to me. So in this game, the guy's complaining a little bit about how there's Viking ships in the game, and this is like, 1100 years before there's supposed to be Vikings. Well, the ships, if you look at the Sutton Hoo ship, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between that and a Viking ship unless you look at the mast cleat. If you don't know what a mast cleat is, and then look up um, Viking ship reconstruction, and they'll pop up a description of the um, Viking ship Harold Fairhair, I believe is what it's called. And they'll show you the construction of the mast cleats. So, unless you really pay attention to the mast cleat, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Also, if the mast cleat on those Viking ships is that specific, there is a possibility that they borrowed it from somebody else. A lot of the ships that we're seeing, they have so many different innovations on them, and so many of these ships are so completely different from one another. I mean, we're finding stuff basically based on the era that the Vikings went into a particular region. Some of the stuff that they later put onto their ships, they took from Mediterranean construction. Also, when we're talking about Julius Caesar and his legions, they had to build their own boats, sometimes on site. And it was very specifically the Danish that they used for doing that. Julius Caesar wrote about that on more than one occasion. These people could slap a boat together pretty quick and it would get them where they needed to go. If the boats were destroyed, no problem, they'd build another one. They'd build it out of green wood if they had to. And the Vikings actually built their oak ships out of living trees. They chopped these trees down and did not allow them to season for a year like most other places would. And there's a reason for that as well. You want to get them formed so that when they do dry, they're cured in place and in position. Once they're cured in place and in position, then you can soak the thing, the wood swells, and it becomes seaworthy. Seals up all the joints. Also, because it was formed while the wood was green and allowed to cure in place, you don't have boards that are steam bent in order to bend a certain way. Well, if you've ever worked with steam bending, you know that once you encounter a large quantity of water, or possibly some heat, or more steam, then that piece wants to straighten itself out with the grain again. And because of the way that basically it's a plastic that holds all of the cells together, the way that it forms as it dries creates the shape that that board is going to want to stay in once it gets wet. So it's really important to understand the methods, but also why they did certain things. Why is it that the Norsemen built with green wood while the Carthaginians built with seasoned wood? Why is it that the Norse made most of their ships individual and different, whereas the Carthaginians basically made what the British would call a flat pack, or what we would call pre-assembled or some assembly required? You know, you get your bookshelf, but it's just a bunch of stacked wood, and you pull it out and the bag of nuts and bolts, and you twist the stuff where it needs to go, and voila, you got yourself something constructed. That's being modular to some degree. Um, Part of being modular means you can take one piece out and replace it with another piece. Now, as far as the Viking ships went, if you had a problem with something, you basically had to tear the whole boat apart. With the Carthaginians, if you had an issue, you basically had to tear the whole boat apart. If you were Egyptian and you had an issue, you just had to cut the line in a couple of places and retie it. So now that we're looking at modern technology and a lot of the things that we're utilizing as modern technology, we're also realizing that there's a lot of old technology that is still useful, still usable, and still viable. So a lot of the stuff that they're saying, kind of like what they say about the Germans for World War One and World War Two, about how ingenious they were, or same thing about the Romans, how ingenious they were. Not really. What they were is wise enough to realize that a good idea is a good idea regardless of where it came from. That something that is useful regardless of who came up with it. That something that increases the output is going to increase the output regardless of which professional does it. Although it does need to be a professional. You don't want an idiot like me working on your boat. I've helped to build a couple of boats before, and when I say helped, I mean very minimalistic. I don't mean that I built the entire boat myself. I have built an entire boat nearly by myself. It was a kayak that I built here in Tillamook, and a couple of people here named Pun and Tiffany helped me to wrap it and get it on the water to see how well it worked. Worked pretty good. Then again, that wasn't my idea. That was something that I wanted to do, but also I'd seen many people on YouTube do that, and I borrowed their idea. I don't think Metallica would like that much, but many of these people who are making these saran wrapped kayaks, well, they're telling you straight up, go ahead and do this yourself. Let me show you something here, if I can get it out. That is specifically for that, actually. I literally have the roll of saran wrap right here. This is the roll of saran wrap that I made that boat out of. I'm going to be using some of the same materials this time around for my next project. Because, see, I make that for prototyping, to test out a concept. You use the garbage for making the conceptual idea. Once you can prove that it works and you've got something to show, then you can make something a little bit more polished. And then that gives you something that you can go out and test out, and people look at it and go, well, that doesn't look like it was made out of garbage. Now, once you get the bugs worked out, you can actually build a production model. Now, with that production model, basically all you got to do is take your working model, disassemble it, turn it into templates and jigs, and use that one boat to manufacture thousands just like it. It's kind of like the situation with 3D printers. If you 3D print a part that takes you 8 hours, right, because it's a small part, I saw a printer make something, it's about that big, probably about 6 inches by 6 inches, and it did take a really long time to print it. Now, when you cast something, it doesn't take nearly that long. So a lot of times when you're prototyping, you might use the computer to print something out on your 3D printer that's your prototype, but because it's plastic, it's not going to work. But then again, you can use that plastic, make a mold of the plastic piece, and then cast into the mold. You can take that plastic piece and you can cast 30 or 40 molds out of it, or 3 or 400 molds out of it. If it's something that, you're intending people in third world countries to be able to utilize it, let's say you make a special, casting so that people can mold clay into a particular vessel that's useful for some reason. And you don't want to sell the clay itself, that's really expensive. Also, why the hell would you want to sell clay vessels to countries that already make clay vessels? But you might sell them the molds, kind of like a cake mold or a cookie cutter mold or things of that nature. You're not selling the cookies, you're selling people the ability to use their own ingredients to make specially shaped cookies. So when I was listening to this guy complaining about how they had Viking ships and how they, what did he call it? Breaks the continuity. This is supposed to be sort of a historically based game. Well, it doesn't break continuity at all. Matter of fact, even the mast, or not the mastheads, the beak heads or the figureheads. The Viking figureheads, most of them were Celtic. Most of the ships around Great Britain and the north coast of France were also Celtic. The Gaul were primarily a Celtic people, whereas today we associate the Celtic people with either Boston or with Ireland. It used to be that you couldn't find anywhere in Britain where you weren't going to find them, or anywhere in France for that matter, parts of Germany, and even further north. So when it comes to history, there's a lot of really cool stuff, and we give a lot of people credit for inventing things they didn't invent and doing things that they didn't do. Also, when it comes to Vikings wearing horned helmets, yes, a Viking could and probably did wear horned helmets. That doesn't mean that every raider out there was wearing a horned helmet, just like not every pirate was wearing a tricorn hat. However, if you are wearing a soft knit cap and that's your protection in battle, and you have the opportunity to take a metal helmet and it happens to have horns on it, if you don't like the horns, knock them off. There are even depictions from the Vikings themselves of Vikings wearing horned helmets, as well as descriptions later on of fighting against people with horned helmets. In some of the Viking sagas, there's actually one story of a guy who took off his helmet and impaled another man with the horn on his helmet. The idea here, though, is that it's not like it was part of the friggin' uniform. When it's stated that there's no evidence that Vikings ever wore horns on their helmets, that's absolutely not true. It just wasn't a Viking thing. It's kind of like you might smoke crack and you might be black, but that doesn't mean that every black person smokes crack, and it doesn't make smoking crack a black thing. It's kind of like slavery here in the United States. Sure, most of the slave owners were white, but that doesn't mean every white person in America owns a slave. It also doesn't mean that no black person in America ever owned a slave, because that's absolutely not the case either. There were black slave owners. So I guess this is a long one, and I apologize for making it so long. But with what I've been learning about boats, because I like boats, I've also been learning about the different technologies and how they come together. There's a type of Taiwan split prow that was real famous about 1100 years ago. And that Taiwan boat was based off of a Chinese junk, which is several thousand years old, with a split prow. They call it gull wings or eagle wings or just wings. Even on a Hawaiian proa, um, that's basically a canoe with an outrigger. Their outrigger has the same exact thing. The same thing with the uh, Maori. A lot of these different boats, as well as here in Washington, or here in the Pacific Northwest too, by the way, the split prow on the dugout canoes of the Pacific Northwest. We've also come to realize more recently that there's bloodlines that have been, um, how do we explain genetics? We used to have to guess as to where peoples came from. Now we've discovered that in Washington state and parts of South America, there is actually bloodlines from the Polynesian people. There's also boats that have that very particular gull wing front that seems to be something that is an accumulated knowledge from the Chinese and the Taiwanese on down to Madagascar, Hawaii, Guam. I mean, all over the place. We've also got some of the, I guess they call them riders now, but it's a set of forks that come off the front of your boat, and they're made for ramming another ship under the water. These things come up at an angle, and when you run into an enemy boat, instead of slamming into the side of it, they ride up over the top of it, and your ship actually pushes the other boat underwater. And it's kind of similar, I guess, to the Greek rams, sort of, except there's two of them, and they come way up out of the water. They don't try to hit your ship at the water line and sink you that way. They just put their whole boat on top of you. And later on in the Mediterranean, there were actually some ships that were created that way, which has a lot to do with the influence of trade. And we like to think of our global trade today as something that's brand new and recent. But reality shows us that for thousands and thousands of years, human beings have traded along long, vast distances. During the Bronze Age, the British were trading tin all the way to people in China, not directly, of course. That would have been through France, Switzerland, Sweden, those kind of areas that were trading beads and bead crafts for items from Britain that were being traded from those people over to, well, the East. Um, it took a long time for some technologies to travel, such as the Bronze Age when it first started. There's about, I don't know, there's over 1,000 years in between when the Bronze Age began in the East and when it finally came west. The reason for that is because that was something that was protected. Sure, they might give you the bronze, but they weren't going to tell you how they made it. Slowly over time, it filtered out. Eventually, just like with silk, we did find out where these wonderful things came from along the Silk Road. So, I guess I'm done talking to myself basically with a camera on. Um, I'm going to get back to watching videos about boats and boat technologies, and I'm going to revel at the fact that humans think they're so smart because they have accumulated knowledge. Accumulated knowledge is the knowledge that somebody else had to figure out And then, lucky you, they passed it on to you without all of that effort, without all of that critical thinking. So you can tell yourself that German engineering is so great and wonderful, and the Vikings came up with all these new innovations. And no, not really. If you want to build something, build it. If I buy something, even if I buy it brand new, I'm going to modify it to what I want. A lot of people have seen me working on a project that I wanted, something that I wanted, and I was building it out of garbage. They made the assumption that I wanted something in specific and bought me something brand new. Well, there's a reason I didn't buy anything brand new. I was going to tear it apart. So when people buy me something brand new and I modify it and they get angry with me, I'm like, well, the whole point here wasn't to accumulate a bunch of extra shit I got to carry. The point here was to make something useful and something else useful and combine the ideas together into one implement I can carry with me instead of 2, 3, 4, 5, however many else. The Swiss Army knife kind of idea. Anyway, good to be with you. Thanks for coming to visit. Stay out of trouble or don't get caught. And remember, you are your brother's keeper. No victim left behind.